Executive presence is one of the most weaponized, misunderstood phrases in the shallow corporate ecosystem. Legacy business culture defines it through a lens of dominant extroversion, where being the loudest voice in the room, dominating physical space, or maintaining hyperavailability is what commands respect. But we know true presence isn't loud, it's gravitational. Welcome back to Built to Sway. I'm Dana Hewling, the low-key visionary. In this week's edition, we're redefining presence and constructing authoritative visibility that owes absolutely nothing to performance or volume. Let's lay out the blueprint. When the shallows talk about presence, they often mean something along the lines of being visible quantitatively. That's the first thing I want you to let go of. When we talk about presence, I want you to think in terms of depth and qualitatively. We don't need to be everywhere all the time or even the loudest, because our depth accomplishes the exact scale that others require constant frequency to replicate. Now, we can't ignore that executive presence is a critical catalyst for professional progression. Data shows that it accounts for roughly 26% of what decision makers weigh when evaluating leaders for advancement. This is broken down into three pillars. Gravitas at 67%, which is defined as confidence and composure under pressure. Communication at 28%, the ability to articulate a vision, and appearance at 5%, which acts as a silent derailer if it doesn't fit the corporate mold. But here's a structural flaw. The criteria is entirely subjective. Because legacy culture defines gravitas and communication through a narrow, dominant, and often extroverted lens, executive presence has become a playground for bias. In fact, 56% of minority professionals report being held to significantly stricter unwritten codes of presence compared to just 31% of their white peers. Even worse, 81% of women report being completely unclear on how to act on the feedback they receive about their presence because the critiques are notoriously contradictory, confusing, and constantly shifting. Think about the sheer emotional tax of that dynamic. You are being asked to hit a moving target while wearing a performative mask that wasn't designed for your load-bearing humanity. This is exactly where the shallows will not so subtly encourage you to mask harder, speak louder, and occupy more physical space. I advocate for a completely different architecture. We're going to stop trying to master their subjective real-time performance game. Instead, we're going to bypass it entirely through asynchronous visibility. We're going to take our gravitas and your communication frameworks off of a volatile bias stage and embed them permanently into unshakable digital infrastructure that speaks for you before you ever walk through the door. If you recall the blueprints we drew out last week, we built the literal machine for this, the silent salesman. We engineered the website vaults, the LinkedIn monuments, and the intake pipelines. Today, we're calibrating how you, the operator, occupy that system. And it requires us to explicitly define a word we've used before that the shallows love to throw around as corporate jargon: asynchronous. In structural engineering and computing, asynchronous communication means systems operating independently without needing a synchronized real-time clock. In the architecture of leadership, asynchronous means completely decoupling your authority from your immediate physical presence. It means your genius is working, filtering, and commanding respect in a room while you're eating dinner, solving an isolated problem, or entirely disconnected from the grid. That you no longer rely on the volatile, high-tax performance of real-time interactions to prove you're competent. So how do we execute this? It begins with the first core mechanism of asynchronous visibility, the sovereign framework deposit. The legacy playbook dictates that to earn a project, pitch, or role, you must perform and over-explain. while donning their desired version of your personality to win the room. That is a massive drain on your load bearing humanity. A low key visionary does the exact opposite. You pre deposit your expertise. Inside the visibility vault, we call this mapping your signature POV. By identifying the precise, unshakable hills to die on and perspectives that separate your genius from generic industry noise. Then we take that payload and execute a sovereign framework deposit. To do this, you take those documented hills to die on, your data diagnostics, and your case studies, then you embed them permanently onto unshakable digital assets inside your perimeter, that is on your LinkedIn monument or within your website's intelligence vault. When you deposit your frameworks asynchronously, they act as an operational airlock. Before a prospect or stakeholder ever books a synchronous minute on your calendar, they are forced to interact with your documented mind. They read your methodology, they process your metrics, and they adapt to your terminology. By the time you actually walk into the meeting, 90% of the performative convincing is already finished. You don't have to shout to command presence because your blueprint has already quietly re engineered the room in your favor. This brings us directly to the second mechanism of asynchronous visibility, asynchronous boundary signaling. The shallows will tell you that to command respect, you must be hyper available. They preach the gospel of an open door policy and instant responsiveness. They want you to believe that visibility is measured by how fast you reply to an email or how easily someone can drop a meeting onto your calendar. But let's look at the actual physics of authority. Commodity is cheap, scarcity is premium. When you make your real-time humanity endlessly available to anyone with a link, you aren't demonstrating executive presence. You're signaling that your time has no gatekeeper. Asynchronous boundary signaling flips this entirely. It means your silent infrastructure does the heavy lifting of establishing your exclusivity long before you enter the conversation. Remember the positive strategic friction we designed into our silent salesman last week? This is where it transforms from an operational tool into a psychological asset. When a prospective client or stakeholder encounters your gated perimeter, their brain automatically adjusts to your posture. They instantly realize they're not dealing with a desperate vendor chasing a transaction. They realize they are approaching a sovereign expert who protects their perimeter with clinical precision. Notice what's happening here. You haven't spoken, you haven't shouted, you haven't performed at a whiteboard, yet your executive presence has already filled the room. Your strict structural boundaries have signaled absolute authority entirely in your absence. You aren't hiding behind systems out of fear. You're leveraging systems to communicate that your authority is undeniable and that your load-bearing humanity is insulated, highly calibrated, and absolutely non-negotiable. Which brings us to the third and final mechanism of asynchronous visibility, asynchronous evidence architecture. Traditionally, presence is often mistakenly coupled with defensive explanation. You are told that to secure a high-level buy-in or advance to the next level of leadership, you must be a master of the real-time pitch. You're expected to sit in a conference room and exhaust your energy currency, dynamically proving your worth, defending your track record, and reacting to subjective skepticism. That's a high-tax, low-posture game. An asynchronous leader doesn't defend their track record in real time. You architect it into the perimeter. Now, do you remember the flagship model we discussed in our last briefing? This includes the systems that house our proprietary intelligence vaults and IOR ledgers. This is the asset layer that transforms your past wins into active, silent negotiators. Asynchronous evidence architecture means taking your case studies, your institutional histories, your client transformations, and your verified diagnostic data and transforming them into static, undeniable monuments of proof. When an industry leader or high level client passes through your boundary gates, they shouldn't encounter a generic portfolio that begs for approval. They should encounter a clinical record of execution. When your evidence is engineered asynchronously, it acts as a permanent witness to your authority. Prospects read the exact metrics of how you solved complex institutional shifts. They review the clinical logs of your frameworks in action, and they realize your genius is entirely non negotiable. By the time you actually open the airlock for a synchronous conversation, the question of if you can deliver is already settled. The only remaining question is when you begin. You've completely bypassed the defensive pitch game because your architectural evidence layer has already quietly commanded the room entirely in your absence. Now, a critical question remains. What happens when a prospect or stakeholder successfully passes through all three asynchronous gates? They have proven their intent, verified their budget, and accepted your friction. Now they are finally in the room with you live. How do you maintain your gravitas when the interaction shifts from asynchronous to real time? You execute the maintenance matrix. The biggest mistake quiet leaders make is switching postures the moment a live call or meeting begins. They build an incredible sovereign digital parameter, but the second they get on a Zoom call, they morph into a people pleaser, over explaining their choices, accommodating chaotic timelines, and offering unpaid strategy on the fly. When you do that, you break the spell. You tell the client that your infrastructure was just an illusion and that you're actually easily manipulated in real time. Maintaining your gravitas in live environments requires three non negotiable operational rules. First, maintain diagnostic posture. As an expert, you're not a vendor auditioning for a job. You are an engineer reviewing a schematic. We don't pitch our genius. We analyze their structural leaks. Let them do 70% of the talking. Your presence is not felt through the volume of your answers, but through the clinical precision of your questions. Second, decouple delivery from immediacy. Just because a high stakes client asks a question live doesn't mean they're entitled to an immediate answer. True gravitas is comfortable with silence. It sounds like saying, that's a load bearing problem. Instead of giving you a shallow answer on this call, my team and I will audit the situation asynchronously and send our diagnostic protocol by Tuesday. And third, insulate your calendar currency. Your live availability should remain highly scarce. Synchronous time is a surgical strike, not an open sandbox. Limit your live consulting or partnership blocks to specific designated windows during the week, leaving the rest of your cognitive energy completely air-gapped to do the actual deep work. Time blocking has been life-changing for me personally. When your live operations match your digital infrastructure, the client experiences absolute consistency. They realize that your peace, your time, and your load-bearing humanity are fully protected, and they will respect your authority 10 times more because of it. Let's be entirely candid as we close this brief. You do not owe the shallows an exhausting real-time performance. More than a quarter of your career progression is tied to executive presence, yes, but that doesn't mean you have to surrender your piece or change your configuration to fit a broken subjective mold. Stop trying to hit a moving target in a room that isn't computing your true value. Focus on what you can control, the architecture of your foundation. Your directive this week is to audit the qualitative weight of your presence. Look at your digital perimeter and ask yourself honestly, is your genius pre-deposited through a signature POV framework, or are you still relying on frantic real-time meetings to prove you belong? Are your boundaries signaled through positive strategic friction, or is your availability completely commoditized? If you pull back the curtain and realize you're still shouting for visibility, or worse, staying hidden to avoid the noise, it's time to harden your infrastructure. The blueprint is clear. If you're ready to extract your heels to die on and master the mechanics of the sovereign deposit, Visibility Vault is waiting. If you're an individual practitioner looking to calibrate your asynchronous presence under my direct supervision, submit an application for the next lab cohort. And if you represent a mid-market enterprise ready to build a permanent high-posture corporate flagship, request a fractional partnership with BID. Every resource, every gate, and every alignment application is securely housed at built2sway.com. That's built2sway.com. From now on, your presence will be felt long before your voice is ever heard. Until next time, the build continues. Stay high key.